The first time my daughter touched the back of her left ear during a family meal, she was 9 years old, and she did it because her grandmother had cornered her in the den with a slide carousel and was 3 slides into a 14-slide retrospective of a 1978 trip to Branson, Missouri. I caught her eye from across the room. She touched her ear. I cleared my throat and said something about needing her help carrying boxes down from the attic, and she escaped, and that night we made the signal official. Left ear, 2 taps, fingers folded. It meant get me out of here without making it weird. Over the years, it had pulled her out of bad school dances, a youth group lock-in, one truly disastrous double date her sophomore year of college, and the wake of a great uncle she had only met twice. She was 34 now. She had a master's in public health and a mortgage and a husband and a 5-year-old of her own, and she had not used the signal in close to a decade. She used it on a Saturday in October, sitting at my kitchen table, while her father-in-law smiled at her and told my wife about a quarterly distribution. His name was Houston Birchwood. He was 61, broad through the shoulders in the way men get when they've spent their 20s on construction sites and their 50s at desks, and he had a voice you wanted to trust. He had been in my daughter's life for almost 2 years. My son-in-law's mother had passed from a stroke when my son-in-law was 23, and Halston had remarried 5 years later to a kind, quiet woman named Margene, who taught 3rd grade in Greensboro. Margene was not at the table. Halston had driven up from North Carolina alone, he said, because Margene had a fall festival at her school and could not get away. He had brought a bottle of bourbon I did not recognize, and a tin of homemade pecan brittle his sister had made, and he had been at my kitchen table for 40 minutes where my daughter touched her left ear. My name is Whitman Easterbrook. I'm 62 years old. I spent 26 years as a special agent with the FBI, the last 14 of those in the white-collar division out of the Charlotte field office, working securities fraud, affinity fraud, and elder financial exploitation. I retired 3 years ago, and now I do part-time contract work for a private firm in Raleigh that consults on internal fraud investigations for mid-cap financial services companies. I have sat in interview rooms across from men who had stolen 9-figure sums from people who trusted them. I have testified in federal court more times than I can count. I have watched grown men cry about their grandmother's retirement, and grown women lie to my face about money that no longer existed. Houston Birchwood, sitting at my kitchen table in Asheville on a Saturday afternoon, was telling me about an opportunity, and my daughter had just told me, without saying anything at all, that she was scared. He had been talking about land, specifically about a thing he called a managed timber yield trust. He said it the way people say a phrase they have rehearsed in front of a mirror. The trust acquired tracts of working timberland in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, he explained, and partnered with sustainable forestry operators to manage cyclical harvests. And the returns to the trust beneficiaries were a function of both the lumber yields and the appreciation of the underlying land. He said you could get into the trust at a $50,000 entry tier, but the preferred allocation, which gave you a higher quarterly distribution and priority on the appreciation pool, started at $200,000. He said it the way a friend tells you about a good restaurant. My wife, whose name is Rosalind, asked him the question that any reasonable person would ask, which was how this was structured for tax purposes. He answered smoothly. He used the phrase pass-through entity. He used the phrase pass-through entity. He used the phrase grantor trust election. He used the phrase qualified intermediary. He was using real words and arranging them in patterns that sounded correct. I asked him who the trustee was. He said the trustee was a firm out of Knoxville called Cumberland Heritage Fiduciary, which I had never heard of, and which I made a mental note to look up the moment he left. My daughter, whose name is Marigold but who has gone by Goldie since the 2nd grade, was sitting to my right. Her husband, Reese, was not there. He was at home in Charlotte with their daughter, who had come down with a fever on Friday afternoon, and Goldie had driven up alone Saturday morning because Halston was already coming and she didn't want to cancel. She had been quiet during most of the conversation. She had been listening to her father-in-law describe the trust, and she had been watching my face, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation she had touched the back of her left ear with 2 fingers, fingers folded. Rosalind, who has been married to me long enough to read the inside of my forehead, stood up and asked Halston if he wanted coffee. She asked it the way she asks it when she's about to leave the room and wants me to handle whatever is happening. Halston said he would love coffee. Rosalind put her hand on Goldie's shoulder as she passed and asked Goldie to come help her grind the beans, which is something nobody in my family has ever needed help with, and the two of them disappeared into the kitchen. Halston smiled at me across the table. He had a real smile. That was the thing about him. There was nothing rehearsed about the warmth. "I know it sounds like one of those things," he said, leaning back, "but I'll tell you, Whitman, I was skeptical too. I sat with it for almost a year before I put any of our money into it. Marjane wanted to know everything. We had our CPA look at the structure. I'm not the kind of guy who jumps." "What does your CPA think of it?" I asked. He waved a hand. She had questions at first, everybody does, but once she understood the structure, she was comfortable. She actually moved some of her own family money in last spring. "That's interesting," I said. "It's not for everybody," he said. "But Reese and Goldie are at the age where they're starting to think about the long arc, you know. College for the little one, retirement, all of it, and the kind of yields the trust has been throwing off. I'd hate for them to be 10 years down the road and wishing they'd known." He held my eyes when he said that. He was good at holding eye contact. Not aggressive, not weird, just steady. The kind of eye contact that makes you feel like the person across from you is actually seeing you. I smiled and told him I was always interested in learning about new structures. I told him I had spent my career in the regulatory side of the financial world, and I appreciated the chance to look at something new. I asked if he had any documentation I could review. I said it warmly, the way a retired man with time on his hands asks about a hobby. He brightened. He had a folder in his bag, he said. He'd brought it specifically because he wanted Reese and Goldie to see it, but he was glad to walk me through it. He pulled out a leather portfolio and laid out a stack of papers on the kitchen table. There was a glossy prospectus with a photograph of a creek running through a stand of pines on the cover. There was a one-page summary of historical distributions going back to 2017. There was a subscription agreement and a wire instruction sheet. I read through the prospectus slowly while he sipped his coffee. The historical distribution chart showed average annual returns of 19%, which is a number that does not appear in nature. The prospectus referenced an independent third-party valuation of the underlying timberland, but the name of the valuation firm did not appear anywhere in the document. The trustee, Cumberland Heritage Fiduciary, was listed at an address in Knoxville on Lonsdale Avenue. The accountant of record was a CPA firm I had never heard of in Asheville. The minimum subscription was $50,000. The preferred tier began at $200. The investment window for the current cycle, the document noted in a small italicized footnote on page 17, closed on November 15th. That was 4 weeks away. "Halston," I said, "can I keep this?" "Keep all of it," he said. "I have copies. I want you to have time with it. I want Reese to have time with it. There's no rush from my end. The fund itself has the cycle window, but that's just the administrative thing on their side." I told him I appreciated that. I told him I'd take a careful look. I told him I'd circle back to him in a few days with any questions. He nodded and said he was around any time. He gave me his cell number even though I already had it. Rosalind and Goldie came back in with the coffee. We talked for another 40 minutes about other things. Goldie's daughter and the school district they were in, and the new restaurant on Biltmore Avenue, and the leaves changing on the parkway. Halston was lovely. He was funny. He told a story about a dog he and Marjane had adopted that ate an entire box of Christmas ornaments and survived. Goldie laughed in the right places. She had her face under control. But every once in a while her eyes would find mine across the table, and I would see what was behind them, which was a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a while and had finally set it down where someone else could see it. He left around 4. He had a 4-hour drive ahead of him and wanted to make it home before Marjane got back from the festival. Rosalind walked him to his car. I stood in the kitchen with Goldie and I waited until I heard his engine start and I said, "How long?" She closed her eyes for a second. Then she opened them and she said, 6 months, maybe 7. He brought it up to Reese first. Reese said no the first time. Then Halston brought it up again at Easter. Then again over the summer. Reese has been going back and forth. Dad, he's been losing sleep. He thinks if he doesn't do this, his father's going to think he doesn't trust him. He thinks if he does do this, we're going to lose everything we've worked for. How much is Halston asking for? 200,000. The preferred tier. He's been very specific about that number. I leaned against the counter. "What do you have in liquid?" "We have about 90 in the savings. The rest is in our 401ks and the equity in the house." "He's asking you to pull from the 401ks. He's said it twice now. He says there are ways to do it without the penalty. He says he'll connect us with someone." "Of course he will." She looked at me. "Dad, I love him. He's been so good to Reese. He really has been. When Reese's mom died, Halston was a wreck for years. He raised Reese mostly by himself. And then he met Margin, then he's been like a father to me too. He came to the hospital when Coraline was born. He drove all night." "I'm not telling you he isn't a good father-in-law," I said. "I'm telling you that what he just showed me is not a real investment fund." She put both hands flat on the counter, and she looked down at them for a long moment. Rosalind came back in through the side door and looked at the two of us and quietly poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table and waited. "How do you know?" Goldie said. "Not a challenge. A request." I told her about the distribution numbers, which were impossible on a sustained basis from a working timber asset. I told her about the missing valuation firm. I told her about the artificial deadline, which is the single most consistent feature of fraudulent offerings, because legitimate investments do not need urgency to close. I told her that the address in Knoxville and the CPA in Asheville needed to be verified, and I told her I would verify them on Monday, but that I already had a strong opinion about what I was going to find. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you think he's the one running it, or do you think he's been pulled in by someone else?" That was the right question. It was the question I had been asking myself. "I don't know yet," I said. "There are two possibilities. He's either the architect or he's a victim who's now actively recruiting. In some ways the second is worse, because it means he's already lost his own money and is trying to recoup by bringing in family. We've seen that pattern more times than I can count. And if he's the architect, then he's been planning this for a long time, and Reese was always the point. We just have to figure out which one it is. And we have to figure it out without him knowing we're looking." Rosalind, very quietly from the table, said, "Goldie, sweetheart, does Reese know what you came up here to do?" Goldie didn't answer for a second. Then she shook her head. "He knew I was coming to see you. He didn't know I was going to say anything. He's been so torn up about this. I don't think he can even let himself believe what I think might be true." "Then we have to be careful with him too," I said. "He has to come to it on his own, or he'll never be able to live with what we have to do next." Goldie nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "What do we do?" she said. "You go home tonight," I said. "You go home tonight," I said. "You tell Reese you and I had a good visit. You don't say anything about the trust. You don't say anything about your father-in-law. You let me make some calls Monday morning, and then you and I are going to have a real conversation, and we're going to bring Reese into it carefully. But we're not going to confront Halston yet, not until we know what we're standing on." She nodded again. She got up and came over and hugged me hard. She is not someone who hugs hard often. She hugged like a person who had been holding her breath for half a year. That night, after she'd gone, I sat in my study with the prospectus and a yellow legal pad and a cup of decaf, and I worked. Monday morning at 8, I called a man named Booker Anselm. Booker had been with the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance, Securities Division, for about a decade before he retired 2 years ago. He and I had worked a Ponzi case together in 2014 that crossed 3 states and ended with 27 indictments. He owed me nothing, but he liked to be useful, and he picked up on the third ring. I gave him the name Cumberland Heritage Fiduciary and the Lonsdale Avenue address. He laughed. Not a mean laugh, just the laugh of a man who has heard a lot of bad names for shell companies. He said he'd call me back. At 9:15, I called a forensic accountant in Charlotte named Yumiko Halverson, who had been an expert witness on 3 cases I'd worked. I read her sections of the prospectus over the phone. She asked me to fax her the historical distribution chart and the page describing the valuation. I sent it to her from the machine in my study, which I keep mainly because people like Yumiko prefer fax for documents they're going to mark up. Booker called back at 10:40. "Whitman," he said, "Cumberland Heritage Fiduciary is registered in Tennessee. The registration is current. It was incorporated in March of 2019. The registered agent is a paralegal service in Knoxville that handles about 400 shell entities. The principal listed on the incorporation paperwork is a man named Carrick Von Ostro, who is listed at a residential address in several. I ran Carrick Von Ostro through our old systems. He's got a 2011 conviction in Georgia for wire fraud, served 18 months, out in 2014. And the firm's regulatory status? It is not registered as a trust company in Tennessee. It is not registered as an investment advisor with the state or with the SEC. It is a $35 a year LLC with a fancy name and a felon at the helm. That's it. Booker, you're a saint. I'm a retired man with time on my hands, same as you. Yumiko called at 1 in the afternoon. Her voice had the particular tone it gets when she's about to tell me something she finds offensive on a professional level. Whitman, she said, the distribution chart is generated. The numbers are too clean. Look at the trailing decimals. They follow a sinusoidal pattern across quarters that no real working asset would produce. Whoever made this used a spreadsheet to back into a target IRR and didn't bother to disguise the math. The valuation section refers to an independent appraiser without naming them, which is a violation of the basic disclosure standard any real private placement would meet. And the subscription agreement contains a provision in Section 9.3 that gives the trustee unilateral authority to reallocate beneficiary interests at their discretion. That is not a feature of any legitimate trust I have ever seen. That is a feature designed to make it legally defensible when the money disappears. How long would it take you to write that up in a way I could share with a family member? By tomorrow night. I thanked her. I hung up the phone. I sat for a long time looking out the window at the dogwoods in my backyard which were starting to turn red, and I thought about Halston Birchwood, who had driven 4 hours to sit at my kitchen table with a bottle of bourbon and a tin of pecan brittle, and who had told me a story about a dog eating Christmas ornaments, and who was either a victim or a predator, and either way had been pulling my son-in-law toward a cliff for 6 months. I called Goldie that evening. I told her what Booker and Yumiko had told me. She was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, can you come to Charlotte this weekend? I need you to talk to Reese. I can't be the one to do it." I drove down on Saturday morning. Coraline was at a friend's birthday party. The house was quiet. Reese met me at the door. He's a tall man, lean, with his father's eye contact and his late mother's softness around the mouth. He's a high school physics teacher. He is one of the kindest people I have ever known, and he loves my daughter the way I always wanted someone to love her. He knew, when he opened the door, that something was happening. Goldie had told him I needed to talk to him about a work thing. He had nodded and waited. We sat in his living room. I told him everything. I started with the signal at the kitchen table and what it meant. I told him about Cumberland Heritage Fiduciary and Carrick Von Ostro. I told him about Yumiko and the fabricated distribution chart. I told him about the 14 years I had spent doing this work, and the patterns I had seen, and the way these things almost always ended. Reese sat through it without moving. He is a person who processes things by sitting very still. When I finished, he said, "My father is not running a fraud. I don't know yet whether he's running it or being run by it," I said. "But the offering he's been bringing to you is fraudulent. That part is no longer a question." He looked at the floor for a long time. Then he said, "If he's being run by it, what does that mean?" "It means he's already lost money. Probably a lot of it. It means whoever's behind the trust has him on the hook to bring in new investors. It means he's desperate and he's been hiding it from Margene and from you, and the longer this goes on, the worse it gets for everyone, including him." Reese put his hands over his face for a moment. Then he lowered them and he said, "Tell me what to do." I told him. The plan was simple. Reese was going to call his father on Sunday evening and tell him that he had been thinking about the timber trust seriously and that he wanted to commit to the preferred tier, but that he wanted to do it in person. He was going to ask Halston to drive up to Charlotte the following Saturday. He was going to tell him that he wanted to write the check sitting across the table from him, because something this big should be done face to face. Halston would agree. He would agree because every fraud is built on momentum, and the prospect of a $200,000 check being handed across a table is the kind of momentum that overrides caution. When Halston arrived, Reese was going to ask him a series of specific questions. He was going to ask about Cumberland Heritage Fiduciary's regulatory registration. He was going to ask about the named valuation firm. He was going to ask, gently, about how much of Halston's and Margine's own money was in the trust, and whether they had received any distributions, and if so, when and in what form. He was going to have his phone on the table, screened down, recording on the voice memo app, because in North Carolina you can record a conversation you're a party to without disclosing it, and then, depending on what Halston said, Reese was going to make a choice. If his father showed any sign of being a victim himself, of being pulled in by someone else, Reese was going to tell him what we had found and offer to help him get out and to get Margine's money back. If his father showed signs of being the architect, of being knowingly complicit, Reese was going to end the conversation, walk him to the door, and let the people I had already spoken to take it from there. The people I had already spoken to were a special agent named Gwendolyn Pruitt, who was now running the same desk I had retired from at the Charlotte field office, and an assistant United States attorney named Hollis Yardberry in the Western District. I had called them both that week. I had explained the situation, including my own conflict of interest as the father of one of the potential victims, and I had asked for their guidance. They had asked me to keep them informed. They had asked Reese, through me, to preserve any recordings he might end up making. They had not promised anything. They had done what good agents and good prosecutors always do, which was listen carefully and ask the right questions and wait. Saturday came. Halston arrived at 1 in the afternoon. He hugged Reese at the door. He brought a bottle of wine and a children's book for Caroline, who was at a museum with Goldie and Rosalind, which was where we had decided they should be. I was not at the house. I was at a coffee shop 2 miles away with my phone on the table, and I was waiting. Reese called me at 3:45. His voice was strange, not shaky, not loud, something further down than that. "Whitman," he said. "He has called me Whitman since he and Goldie got engaged. He has never called me anything else. He's a victim. He's a victim, and he's been carrying it alone for almost 2 years. He cried, Whitman. He cried for 20 minutes. He put almost $300,000 into the trust in 2023. He never got a real distribution. The 2 times he did get a wire, it was money from another investor that the architect had routed back to him to keep him in. He didn't know that until I explained it to him. He just thought the distributions were slow. The architect told him the only way to make himself whole was to bring in more investors and earn referral credits. He has been trying to bring us in because he is drowning. He hasn't told Margine. He's been planning to sell their second car. Whitman, he's broken. He's just broken." I closed my eyes. I sat for a moment with the relief of it, which was not really relief at all, but something more complicated. Then I said, "Reese, do you have it on the recording? All of it. Did he agree to cooperate?" "He'll do anything we ask him to do. He said he's been waiting for someone to find him out. He said he hasn't slept through a night since June." I drove to the house. I sat in their living room with my son-in-law and his father, and I watched a man 22 years younger than he had looked that morning sit on the couch in a pair of khakis and an old fishing shirt and tell me, with his hands shaking and his voice catching, about a man named Carrick Von Ostro, who had introduced himself at a charity golf tournament in Pinehurst, who had cultivated him for almost a year before the first solicitation, who had used the name of a real timber operation outside Sevierville as cover, who had pulled in at least 11 people that Halston knew of and probably more that he didn't. I called Gwendolyn Pruitt from Reese's kitchen. I told her what we had. I told her Halston was willing to cooperate. She asked to speak to him, and I handed him the phone, and he answered her questions for 40 minutes, sitting at my son-in-law's kitchen table, while Reese stood by the window and looked out at the yard, and I sat with my hands folded on the counter and waited. The investigation that followed was not a fast one. These never are. Carrick Von Ostro was arrested on a federal complaint in Sevierville 11 weeks after that Saturday in February of the following year. He was charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The losses across the scheme were estimated in the initial filings at around $4.1 million. There were 38 identified victims across Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina. Halston Birchwood cooperated fully. The U.S. Attorney's Office, after considering the totality of his role, declined to charge him. He testified in front of a grand jury in March. He told Margene the week after he came back from Charlotte. I was not there for that conversation, but Goldie was. He told her sitting at their kitchen table in Greensboro on a Tuesday night, and he handed her every piece of paper he had, and he told her how much he had lost, and he asked her if she could forgive him. Margene is a stronger woman than most people realize. She forgave him. She was furious for a long time, and she still grieves the money, but she forgave him. They put the house on the market that spring. They moved into a smaller place outside Burlington. Margene kept teaching. Houston took a job working part-time at a lumberyard, which he found, he told me later with a kind of broken laugh, to be deeply ironic. Reese and Goldie did not lose a dollar. Houston was in our lives differently after that. Quieter, more careful. But he was in our lives. Reese did not turn away from him, and I would not have allowed Reese to turn away from him. Because the man I had watched fall apart on that couch in Charlotte was not a man who had set out to harm his son. He was a man who had been targeted by a professional and who had compounded his own catastrophe out of shame. That is a different category of human being than the one I had spent my career chasing. I have spent a long time thinking about the difference. Coraline turned 6 in the spring. We had a small party in their backyard. Halston came up from Burlington for it. He helped my son-in-law set up a piñata in the dogwood tree. Margene brought a cake she had baked herself. Goldie stood with me at the edge of the patio at one point and watched the kids running, and she touched the back of her left ear with 2 fingers folded, and smiled at me. We hadn't talked about the signal since that Saturday in October. We didn't need to. I want to say something as someone who spent more than 2 decades doing this work. The most dangerous financial predators in this country are not strangers calling from overseas. They are not the obvious con men in the loud suits. The most dangerous financial predators in this country are professional, patient, and personable, and they find their victims through community, through churches, through golf clubs, through chambers of commerce, through neighborhood association meetings, to the kind of charity events where a handshake is supposed to mean something. They specialize in what we call affinity fraud, which is the use of shared identity, shared community, or shared trust as the lever of theft. They are extraordinarily good at what they do, and the victims they create become, very often, the most effective recruiters for the next wave of victims because nobody trusts a brochure the way they trust their own family member. If someone in your life, particularly a family member, particularly an older family member, starts pushing an investment opportunity with unusual returns and a closing window and a sense that they are doing you a favor by including you, you need to do 3 things. And you need to do them in this order. First, you need to ask whether the investment is registered with the SEC, which you can verify in about 90 seconds at investor.gov. Second, you need to ask whether the people offering the investment are registered as investment advisors or broker-dealers, which you can verify through FINRA's broker check tool. Also free, also 90 seconds. Third, you need to ask the family member how much of their own money is in it, and how much they have actually withdrawn, in real distributions, traceable to a real bank statement. Not promised. Withdrawn. If any of those answers is missing or evasive, you stop. You do not invest. You call someone with experience and you let them help. And here is the other thing. If someone in your life reaches out to you with whatever signal they have, with a phone call out of nowhere, with an awkward visit, with a hand on your arm at a kitchen table, with 2 fingers behind their left ear, you listen. You do not assume they are overreacting. You do not assume they are paranoid. You take it seriously enough to find out. My daughter has been touching the back of her ear since she was 9 years old. She has never once used it for a reason that was not real. The instincts of the people who love you are the most reliable fraud detection system you will ever have access to. They are better than any regulator, any database, any background check. Trust them. We didn't lose a dollar. Halston's family lost a great deal, and they are still rebuilding, and they will be rebuilding for years. But Reese and Goldie and Coraline are whole. Margene is teaching her 3rd graders. Halston is at the lumberyard. The man who built the trap is in federal custody in Tennessee awaiting sentencing. And somewhere in a kitchen in Asheville on a Saturday afternoon, a grown woman with a master's degree and a 5-year-old daughter touched the back of her left ear with 2 folded fingers, and her father, who had been waiting 34 years for her to need him in exactly that way again, saw it. That is the whole story. If your gut is telling you something, it is not nothing. It never is. I have thought a lot, in the months since that Saturday afternoon, about how a man like Houston Birchwood ends up sitting at his son's kitchen table asking for $200,000 he has no right to ask for. He did not begin as a thief. He began as a man who took a handshake at a golf tournament seriously, who believed that good people who look you in the eye and laugh at the right jokes are who they appear to be. That belief, in the abstract, is a beautiful thing. It is what holds a community together. It is also the exact lever a professional predator uses to pry a life apart. The chain of cause and effect, when I trace it backward, is almost embarrassingly simple. A trust offered too easily. A red flag missed. A small loss compounded by shame. A shame compounded by silence. A silence that, over almost 2 years, turned a decent man into the unwilling recruiter of his own son. None of it happened in a moment. All of it happened one quiet choice at a time. What saved my family was not luck, and it was not my career. What saved my family was a 34-year-old woman who refused to talk herself out of what her gut had been telling her for 6 months. Goldie did not have my training. She had something better. She had the courage to feel what she felt, and the wisdom to know she could not see the whole picture from inside it, and the strength to ask for help from someone outside of it. Those 3 things taken together are what I would teach my granddaughter Coraline if I could only teach her one thing about money, about family, about the world. Feel honestly, think clearly, act with the help of people who love you. The order matters. Skip the first, and you become a person who cannot be reached. Skip the second, and you become a person who flinches at shadows. Skip the third, and you become Halston, sitting alone in a parked car at a lumberyard, planning to sell a second car to cover a hole he cannot fill. I will say something that I have said to younger agents for years, and that I believe more now than I did then. Integrity is not a feeling. It is a series of small, repeated, often inconvenient decisions to be honest with the people closest to you, especially when the honesty is uncomfortable, and especially when the honest thing to say is that you are wrong, you are scared, you need help. The man who learns to say those 3 sentences out loud to the people he loves is a man who cannot be ruined by a stranger at a charity golf tournament. He can be hurt, he can lose money, but he cannot be ruined, because shame is the only material that the long con is built from, and the man who refuses shame leaves the predator with nothing to work with. Reese is becoming that man. His father is, painfully and late, becoming that man too. And Goldie has been that woman since she was 9 years old, with 2 folded fingers behind her left ear, asking quietly to be seen.